All right, so we have now gone through the presidential's foreign policy role, members of cabinet, the basic roles of the president. This is about the advisors and executive agencies. A lot of this kind of follows into that whole line of the president as a legislative leader. This is where you start seeing like a lot of lawyers getting hired, people that help draft legislation, people in political appointed positions, essentially there to help the president impose his agenda or process his agenda through his auspices as president. Essentially, this is the political wing of the president's staff, and there's a little bit of back and forth here because we're going to talk about some of the political style appointees, people who like help him get elected, believe in what he believes in, and these neutral merit-based employees that kind of come in later on, where you're going to find out about 90% of the staff in the bureaucracy that is Washington D.C. have permanent jobs no matter who's in office. So we're going to go over that real fast. This is a pretty short presentation, so it shouldn't take more than 15 minutes if I had to guess. All right, so we have the federal bureaucracy. It's the executive branch, and it's shaped like a pyramid. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at this. You'll see a pyramid in just a moment. That'll kind of explain it out. Directly below the president are the cabinet secretaries and their departments. Below them are literally hundreds of different agencies. So like you have the Department of State, DOD, all those folks. And then below them, there's all these smaller agencies that actually make up the DOD or the Department of State. The agencies are employees of the executive branch. So this is part of that whole, how there's like 3 million some odd executive employees. These are those guys. This is that big organization. And is known as the federal democracy. Basically, it's an organization made of many specialized departments. Now, these departments and agencies carry out the government programs and shape government policy. So from one administration to the next, the nature of that department and what they do could change over time. For example, FEMA is is an executive agency. Their role might change based on who the president is, whether or not where the disaster funds go to, all that stuff. It can change based on who's in charge, because that's the person directing these agencies. So don't get confused. Just because a lot of these jobs will end up being permanent, whether there's a Democrat or Republican in charge, what they're ordered to do by the president, that is what they do. They're supposed to follow the lead of the president. They are employees of the president. They're part of the executive branch, and the head of the executive is the president, regardless of what party they're attached to. First, we have the EOP, the Executive Office of the President. This is that legislative leader section of the president's job. This is where they do bill writing, they prepare reports, they check with other various agencies. This is the kind of thing where like we have an idea for a bill, Mr. President, and he has an idea, and they check it for constitutionality up front, trying to make sure they're writing a good bill, and they do check on work for other agencies. So if another agency says, hey, we got this cool idea down in FEMA, the EOP will try to get a bill drafted to make sure that idea can actually be put into fruition. The White House office is about 500 people who work directly with the president doing this, and I can tell you they're probably mostly lawyers because they're the ones that are helping draft the legislation. The White House staff, this is the closest advisor to the president. It's headed by the chief of staff, and they screen and flow information to the president. So this is a very important job because the president basically is the chief officer for 3 million some odd bureaucratic workers. At the end of the day, every concern, every issue does not make it to the president's desk, and you wouldn't want it to. The man will be stuck in an office all day long just stamping things and listening. Like, it wouldn't be functional. So he basically hires these people down the line that filter information to him, and it becomes an issue when, let's say, you hire the wrong person who tries to protect his job, so he stops filtering the correct information to the president. That's where you run into issues. So your chief of staff is an appointed position that holds a huge amount of power because he's basically the filter that decides what the president really knows about. So sometimes you're going to find out in history that the chief of staff sometimes doesn't do what they're supposed to do, and the president is left kind of in the dark. Council of Economic Advisors. They advise the president about complex economic matters. So not too shockingly, not every president is a doctorate level economist. They don't know about these things. The president is an executive. His job is to administrate, not do research on economics. He will find out and learn more about economics, just like Obama is not a military strategist. He has no military background, so he gets people that basically advise him who are experts in the military. Every president has their areas of expertise and their areas of non-expertise. And most presidents don't have a hardcore knowledge of economics or anything beyond their local level economics. So Trump's a billionaire, yeah. His background is in real estate and some other investment. That doesn't mean he's a expert on all global geopolitical economic issues. He's still going to need those advisors to come in. The OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. This is the legislative branch. Again, this is not legislative branch, excuse me. This is the legislative leader task that the president does. Again, where the first one just general bills like, hey, we want to do this, we want to do that. This office and this group is just to try to prepare a federal budget. And they also monitor government spending. So this is a watchdog group, people that basically watch over government, make sure they do what they're supposed to do. It's also the budget preparing group. So the executive office, the OMB, they basically are the legislative portion of the executive branch that tries to draft out a budget bill and get those ideas put to the Congress so they can pass the president's idea of what the budget should be. Obviously, when you have a president who's Democrat and a Congress who's Republican, that's not going to happen, or vice versa. It becomes very antagonistic to that whole goal. Now, the federal budget lays out the admin's plans and goals for the coming year. So the budget, so this passed not with Trump, but previously with Obama. He had a hostile Congress. He was a Democratic president with a Republican House of Representatives. Guess what? All budgets, because they usually involve taxing, start in the House. That's where they got to end up. So Obama could not get his budget through. He knew when he was writing this budget with his office, they weren't going to get this budget through. However, the budget is a great way to basically put into the public's eye what the goals of the administration are. So even if Obama wants to spend blankety blank on green energy or exploration of different avenues besides coal and fossil fuels, whatever, he can put that in the budget, and it's a way for him to put out in the public's eye, this is what President Obama wants to do for you. And it's a political way to say, but that's what they are not letting happen, they being the Republicans in charge of the House at the time. It's a great way to lay out your agenda without just making a speech. It puts numbers and makes your agenda kind of real and tangible to people. And then you have the National Security Council, the NSC. They help coordinate the military and foreign policy. This includes the Vice President, Secretaries of State, Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are the guys that basically engage in the foreign policy wing of national security. So you're talking about everybody being involved. And including the VP, this is a relatively new advent. I mean, the Vice President having a major role in the White House is a fairly new phenomena. Like when we think about vice presidents, we think about like Joe Biden, who would always take on a very strong foreign policy role, or we think of Dick Cheney, who was always meeting with ambassadors back during the George W. Bush era. But there was a time period when the vice president was basically just a figurehead that didn't really do much unless he was breaking a tie in the Senate. Early on in their history, when John Adams was the second president of the United States, and Thomas Jefferson, who was on the opposite political spectrum as Adams, he was the VP for Adams. When he became vice president, he spent most of his time in his house in Virginia. Like, he didn't govern or anything. He wasn't involved. The same can be said all the way up until the 1960s when Lyndon B. Johnson, before President Kennedy was assassinated, he remarked at one point that he felt like a ghoul because he knew he wouldn't have really any task or a job to do unless the president died. And what he said was kind of almost prophetical, because he actually said, I feel like a ghoul, like I'm waiting for him to die, and then he ends up being assassinated. So it's only very recent, as far as American history is concerned, that the VP actually has a really strong role in the presidency or in the executive branch at all. All right, so this is that pyramid, and I know it's not a pyramid, it's a bar graph, I'm sorry. So this is the source out of this is the executive office of the president. So here's the breakdown. Obviously, president's at the top. It goes down to these smaller agencies, and then from there it goes even further down. So this is a large bureaucracy, and it is a chain of command kind of bureaucracy. You don't sit here and go down from Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives and then skip it and go to the president. You got to go back up to Domestic Policy Council, who then has to go back up again. It's a bureaucracy. There's a lot of people, like, there's a positive side to bureaucracy, which is it makes things more efficient because it makes them compartmentalized. It makes people who are experts in a certain area, it puts them all in one spot so they can do the work more efficiently. Because it's also a bureaucracy, communication tends to be slow. So the good parts of it is they put out good work. The bad part is it's excessively slow at times. That is the positive and the negatives of bureaucracies in general. All right. The cabinet, we've already talked about. So the executive departments, they make policy decisions, they advise the president. So the closest advisors to the president are his cabinet members and his chief of staff. They also call them secretaries. We've already been through all the different departments. But that is what you need to know. They are the advisors. It's the president, then right below them, it's those guys. The VP, again, is a relatively new position as far as having power within the administration. The VP having control over doesn't really have official control over anything except for the Senate. Executive policy, the VP only has as much power as the president actually gives the VP. So there's no official duties for him. But constitutionally and basically by tradition, it goes president, then cabinet secretaries are his closest advisors. So 15 total advisors, just know that. Make sure you know the number. Make sure you know the most recent one is Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. You should have already watched this very short lecture about the various cabinet positions and what they do. And chief among them, the job is to advise the president. There you go. There's an updated list. If you don't like the first way I showed it to you, here's a second way to look at it. You can pause it and take notes if you want to. All right, now we have this other weird area, independent agencies. These are separate from the cabinet, but still report to the president. So basically, these guys kind of report almost directly to the president because chain of command is, well, they're not under a cabinet secretary, so they're not part of the Department of State. They're not under the DOD. They're not under the DOJ or under the Department of Agriculture. They're just this separate entity. Probably the most famous one we know about is NASA, that we like talk about on a daily basis. So it's usually a specialized scientific area. So in this case, space exploration. NASA, that's what they do. It's a very weird thing, especially when it first came out. It's like, well, it's space exploration. This is science? Is this going to be Department of Defense and putting bombs into orbit? Is this going to be Department of State and how we communicate with other countries? So there's it's just a different agency. This is separate and funding's different. We're not going to there is no secretary of NASA that reports to the president. So it's just completely separate. It's a different kind of beast compared to the cabinet secretary positions. And then you have what's called a government corporation. And the only one that you're going to ever hear about is the U.S. Postal Service. It's a nonprofit business owned and run by the government. So it's in the Constitution. Post offices can be made by Congress. So guess what? We have the USPS, United States Postal Service. It's straight out of the Constitution. It's a nonprofit business that's owned and run by the government. And really, it's heavily subsidized. A stamp does not cost 48 cents. A stamp real cost, if it weren't subsidized by the government, where they just give extra money to keep the cost of the people down, would probably be much higher than just 42 to 50 cents per stamp. The cost is probably closer to $1, but because they subsidize through tax money and everything else to keep our communication outlet, which is USPS, cheap, to make communication cheaper, because communication kind of helps foster business and all that stuff. It benefits the government to subsidize the Postal Service simply because it makes communication more easy. And this has changed over time. USPS has been badly hurt by a little thing called email. Email killed USPS for a long time because now people could just sit there and type, and a free message got sent. To do that before, it took a phone call, or it took a stamp and a letter. And there's legal documents that have to be sent by mail. And all of a sudden, there was this weird time period where I can just email it, and that's writing. Because a lot of statutes say you must notify in writing. And usually that meant, okay, hand delivery of a letter or just send a letter by mail, and that would count. Well, now I wrote it on an email, it was free, and they're able to bypass the Postal Service, which kind of hurts them because fewer people use it unless they're sending packages or large envelopes. And then you have what's called a regulatory commission. These guys enforce rules for certain industries. So the NRC, the FCC, so the FCC controls radio waves. They're the guys that say you can't say certain words on TV unless it's 9 o'clock at night and you're not on basic cable. That kind of stuff, to make sure that the little kids don't hear bad words. They also control radio programs. When somebody cusses on TV by accident, that network usually gets fined because the FCC has said you cannot say those certain 4-letter words on TV, and you did, and now you're going to be fined by it. They're basically smaller agencies at the very bottom of the government that enforce laws or rules made by the agencies themselves. Like the FCC writes their own laws that are then approved by Congress, signed into law by the president, just to run things more smoothly. And sometimes they get very, very intrusive. All right, the civil service system. So way back, and you'll learn more about this in U.S. history, or you may have already learned about it when you had it. A guy named Andrew Jackson was very, very famous for engaging what was called the spoils system. There's right there. Basically, he was a kind of a good old boy, and when he got elected, he just gave all his buddies jobs. People that got him elected, he just gave them jobs left and right, whether they were like qualified for the job or not. You want to be ambassador? Yeah, sure. You speak Spanish? No. Well, you can go to Spain. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. Like, it was just so blatantly not related to ability or merit. It was just, hey, you got me elected, so now you're my buddy. You're going to go and be employed in the federal government. Now, we still have some of that, but laws have changed over time to basically make that more and more difficult. Early on, political appointees, like top jobs, would go to the ones that would hopefully be most qualified with ability, but it also went to the ones that got them elected. So if there were two candidates equally qualified in ability, whichever one helped you, that one got the job. So it was a very biased process. Now we have what's called the Civil Service, or the Pendleton Act. It limits the number of jobs the president can give to appointees. The civil service system hires government workers based on the basis of open and competitive examination of merit. So there are extensive government tests, and I believe the website is usajobs.gov, that you'll see all this information, and it's run by the Office of Personnel Management. And when I say that they take a test, I don't mean like they take a test and if you score, like, let's say the number is you got a 70, and to get the job as a postal worker you had to score 50. Well, that's not what they want. They don't want someone that means you're overqualified. So if you really want to be a postal worker and you got to get a 50 on the exam, if you get much above a 50, you're going to be disqualified from the job simply because you are overqualified. And you're probably asking yourself, well, that makes no sense. If you have all these extra qualifications, why wouldn't they want you in there? You're obviously well merited for the job. Well, here's the position of the government. They want stability. If you're overqualified for a job that you take, what are the chances you'll leave that job eventually? Probably pretty high. You're overqualified for it. They want people who are just right for that job. They want someone to come in, ready to go, and never really get out of or advance beyond that job outside of just years of service. They don't want to have a postal worker who's sorting mail who's qualified to be a postmaster at a large post office because of his managerial ability. You want somebody there who's going to do the job, be there for 20 years, and then retire. That's why this bottom bullet, 90% of government employees who have permanent jobs are in the civil service industry. So civil service workers, 90% of government employees have these permanent jobs, and they just stay there. And the idea is that it creates a stability within government. If most of your workforce stays there year after year after year, it means you have a very stable workforce. Now, the negative impact of it is, if their jobs are that secure, how much incentive is there for them to do extra good at their job? That's where you run into issues. So that's the kind of the dichotomy, that's that relationship, the dynamic between, well, we want stability, but we don't want to foster or encourage any form of laziness. And that's the end of that PowerPoint, guys. Make sure you fill in the guided notes. Remember, open note quizzes and tests, and good luck to you.